start with very, well, basic shapes. The sphere, the cone, not the cone. Do you want to do the cone? Yeah, I'll do the cone. Do a quick ellipse. All right, and we got the square. And then we have the cylinder. Very kind of loosely sketched in there. If you don't know how light works on these shapes in a three-dimensional way, it will be very hard to try to understand how light works on a skull or a head. So in these examples, we're going to pretend that there's a light over here in the top left. So it's going to be casting what I'll call sunlight coming from the top left. Now I say sunlight because local light works differently. Since the sun is so huge, it's a giant star, it's bigger than the Earth, so all the light coming to Earth from the sun is parallel. Whereas a local light would be from a single point, like a point light, if you're familiar with 3D programs. Anyway, so if the light is coming from there, I'm just shading with a basic mechanical pencil, 0.7 lead, sumo grip. You can find it on Amazon. With the sphere, it's going to have what is called core shadow, which I'm sure you've seen in many tutorials. But before I do that, I'm just going to do a quick wireframe on top of the sphere, so that you know where things are happening. So let's see if the sphere's shadow is like this. Actually, it would be more offset this way because of this. Oh, it'd actually be over here. Gosh. Whatever. This is not really a rendering, in-depth rendering demo, but whatever. So just the wireframe of that sphere, almost like a longitude and latitude subdivision. In a 3D program. So like if you were to like take one of these little squares out, because when you draw the wireframe you have a little square, and let's say we take this one and we pull it out, it's facing a specific angle, right? And it's facing a certain way. That is what we call a normal in 3D terms. And so this one over here, if we pull that out, it's like aiming this way. And then, you know, the ones that are curving around are kind of aiming towards the back away from us. If you imagine that these little squares on this sphere are pointing in different directions, the ones pointing at the sun will obviously receive the most light. And as the squares start to fall away, as the squares start to aim at different angles, like here it's being pointed at a different angle, obviously a much higher resolution than that, it doesn't have light. So here is where we can see the core shadow because the light is up over to the top left. Let's see if we can get a... Oh, okay, here's a better example. So you can also see that there's going to be bounce light, core shadow, mid-tone transition, and then the highlight area, so on and so forth. So it's a very basic explanation of it. So we'll go ahead and say that sunlight is from the top left. Core shadow is going to be somewhere like that. And let's bring that ball back real quick. You'll notice that the core shadow position will change depending on where the object is. So if it's closer to the light like this, now this is local light, it's not sunlight, so it's acting differently. The core shadow is almost halfway, but not quite. But if I put the ball way over here, the core shadow starts to go to the end, the edge. So we have different things happening. Anyway, so it curves along these normals. And I'm just kind of doing a basic shading. And I'm doing it like this because I plan on smudging it. So again, there's a core shadow. That's what this is right here. You got the bounce light. That's what that is here. And then the highlight area with the midtones. So I'm just using my finger to smudge to get that three-dimensional look. Now, I could go in there and be more academic and really shade it accurately, but the point is that it's important to understand how light works on a sphere, cone, square, and cylinder as we get to those. And I know it's not really a rendering class, but the reflection, or let's say the matte quality or the reflection quality, changes depending on the material. So if this was a chrome ball, you would actually see this shadow reflected in there like that. But we're not doing chrome or anything right now, or at all in this lesson. So you got a bit of ambient occlusion shadow here, or the contact shadow. So very basic, to the point, not too complicated understanding of light. You can kind of get in there and noodle it and make sure that core shadow is really reading like a core shadow. Cool. Feels 3D to me. Let's take a look at the cone. Actually, the cylinder first. I should have put the cylinder there first. So a cylinder also has a core shadow. Let's grab this guy. You'll notice that the core shadow will always be parallel with the direction of the thing. So you'll never see the core shadow like at an angle. Even if the point light source is over here, it will always happen that it might have a stronger highlight and hotspot here, but for a global light, it's always going to have the core shadow along the tube of it. So let's go ahead and look at it like this. So again, go straight up and down, bounce light over here, core shadow, mid-tone, and then the highlight area. And of course, if it's directly facing like the light source over here in the top left, there's going to be a strongest, or let's say the brightest. Actually, yeah, that's kind of cool when it does that with the camera. You see how this area is the brightest white, but the far edge is not. And as it kind of goes back, yeah, anyway, because like this part is actually darker than the highlight, and because the form is rolling around, and that's really important to understand. Anyway, so it goes along here and then it fades out. So let's quickly kind of just shade that cylinder. I like to rotate my paper when I'm doing this so that I'm capitalizing on my let's say arm movement, because I don't want to have to like shade like this in a weird way. Like my arm naturally does this, so I'll turn the paper to what's comfortable for me. So I know that it's not going to be super bright on this side, but the core shadow will end up being somewhere over here. And the way I'm shading is I'll kind of have this motion like this, kind of like a printer, and then I've kind of just developed the muscle memory to kind of stop approximately within the lines. And then as I'm doing this, I just slowly start to press harder and harder. And then fade out this way. Let's get that bounce light in there. And come back back this way. And remember what we talked about regarding this edge being dark as well. Just by doing that, it makes the objects feel like it's rolling in terms of the form into perspective. And it's a nice little trick to avoid having your shapes feel and look flat. And then this top side, now let's go back to this for a second before we do that. If I have the sun, I don't have a son yet, I'm not married, I don't have kids yet, but if I have like a piece of white paper like this, kind of angled at the sun, it will be the brightest it could possibly be in terms of the paper. Now, if we take that same paper and start to rotate it this way and make it flat, now it's facing up, it's still going to be illuminated by the sun, but it won't be the brightest that it could possibly be because, well, it's facing away. Obviously, if it's facing this way, it's not getting any sun at all. Now, granted, it'll light the back of it and whatever, but that's not what I'm trying to say. We'll pretend it's a solid, white shape. So if this is the brightest it can get, let's go ahead and shade that, maybe something like this. This part facing away from the light is going to be slightly darker. It won't be the brightest. So going back to this, I'm going to shade that in just slightly. And then get this all kind of smudged. But the reason I brought this up is because we can still indicate something here that implies something aimed at the sun. Now, if you look really closely, and if you zoom in on most objects, unless it's like a perfect sheer cut, there's a slight bevel that will happen from this side to this side. It kind of, as if like it's sanded down to have a slight curve. So in this case, if we imagine this zoomed in, let's do the top part, let's do this part, zoomed in a lot, you're going to have this kind of like very subtle curvature as opposed to a very sharp edge. Now, again, it is still possible to have a very sharp edge, but in this case, it's kind of fun to do this because if we were to put a wireframe around this, kind of all the way around, since it's a curved shape, there's going to be parts of that that actually are facing the sun. And so basically what I'm trying to say is we can put a fun little highlight right there. I'm just going to pull out the eraser a little bit and just erase along like that. And then we put a little highlight there. That implies that, well, there's a bevel, but also that it's aimed up at the sun. And what I like to do for style is make that highlight brighter or seem brighter by making things around it darker. Whether or not that's what it looks like in reality. This is just a personal thing that I like to do. Cool. I know that the cylinder isn't exactly perfectly drawn, but okay. The reason I did that before I did the cone is because the cone is actually pretty much a cylinder, but this whole top part is just pinched. So let's take a look at one physically. So much like the cylinder, the core shadow goes along the shape of the tube. Same thing here. It goes along the shape, but also meets at a point. So you'll never see the core shadow of a cone aimed away from that point. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah, cool. So, same stuff as applying, core shadow, bounce light, midtone, and highlight. And of course, on the edge, you'll notice it's dark as it turns over to the other side. So let's go back to our drawing. And I'm just going to pick a a place for where the core shadow is going to be, and it's going to be roughly not perfectly in the middle, but closer to that way, depending on where the light is. So I'm just kind of pressing lightly, and as I'm shading, sometimes what I'll do is just keep my hand in the same spot and then rotate the paper around like that. And go back to it and rotate the other way. Leave room for the highlight. Shade that far end, and then make the core shadow slightly darker. Kind of slice off the bottom there, erase it. And there you go. And we could get in there and put like cast shadows and stuff, but it's kind of difficult to calculate that right now. Let's keep it simple with just the understanding of form. And finally, the cube. I think the easiest one to be concerned with. So, very simple. If the face, as we said here, is aimed at the light source, obviously it will be the brightest side in your rendering. But watch what happens when we start rotating it. So if we do this, now these two values are very close because they're both equally facing away from the light source. Well, somewhat equally. What's happening here is what we call a 1-2-2 read. So we have these two are kind of the same value, and that's not. Let me make more sense of that here. So let's just quickly shade it. If you're in this position and you don't know how to figure out the values here, that's fine. Just ask yourself which side is facing away from the sun. Let's just shade that in. This one is facing away from the sun. Boom. Now I'm not really concerned too much with accurate values regarding whether it's halfway to black or all that. We're just pencil sketching. This is not a full in-depth rendering course. It's just the basics. So that side is now shaded in. Now, of course, there will be bounce light here, because if we look at what happens with, I don't know if the camera's picking that up. Actually, if we grab another piece of paper, or if we just lift it. Yeah, so we have a bounce light hitting here, and then the shadow reflecting into it because of that. You see the shadow or the bounce light just not covering it all fully. But most surfaces will have a bounce light. So what I'm going to do is, instead of erasing some bounce light onto this upward, what I'll do is just make this top part darker and shade downward. All right, smudge that. All right, so earlier I mentioned the 1-2-2 read or the 1-1-2 read. In this case, what I want to do is get a 1-2-3 read. What that means is, so right now these two sides are like the same value. There's no contrast between this side and that side. There is slightly subtle shifts, but if I start to rotate this a bit, like that, suddenly this side, this side is now darker than that. Now we have a 1-2-3 read, because, or you could say ABC read, whereas like this is A, but that's also A. But now it's, I lost it. Yeah. Now it's all different values. There's contrast between both sides on both edges, or all three edges, and that's what we're looking for in this case. So at the very least, I can say that, you know, we'll make one that's darker. Well, I'm sorry, lighter than the darkest side, but darker than the lighter side. And for the lighter side, you know, we can call that the highlight, but it's not really accurate. We could just shade it very lightly. I guess it could be a highlight, but I think the highlight is going to happen here on the bevel, right? So now we have contrast happening here, here, and here. Let me just do a 1-2-2 read as an example. If there's light coming from here this time, and I shade this a value, and I shade this the same value, it works. It's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that you can capitalize on creating nice contrast when you're doing the 1-2-3 read versus this 1-2-2 read. Cool. Now we got that out of the way. Let's get this all nice and soft. Let's go ahead and slice the sides. And then, much like that bevel there, we're also going to do the same thing here. And we could be implying that it's a bit glossy or have some kind of semi gloss quality, implying that there's a curved bevel. But it's always a nice little touch to make it look like it's a nice little reflected hotspot. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit more of an advanced idea. So we have implied that these shapes, these three-dimensional shapes, all have the same pretty much local value, meaning they're all just spray painted white or something. Now what I want you to imagine is if we took this cube, and I don't have a marker, but I have a pen. I'm not going to draw on this, but it's as if we're going to take a paintbrush or a permanent marker and draw a darker color on part of it. So if you've seen my warm-up videos on YouTube, this is what I've kind of showed in the past. So let's say we're taking that cube and we're going to draw a line like this, curve around the corner bevel. And what we're going to do is spray paint this side a darker color. Now, it's kind of tricky, but before I do that, I'll do an example over here. So if we have a checkerboard, we'll just kind of do a basic 2x2 square on the ground. And that's what we're working with. And now let's say we have an object floating above that, causing a big shadow over it. So let's kind of just draw maybe like a big floating disc. So the shadow of it is going to do something like this. Now, in normal circumstances, because this doesn't happen in space, but in this case, the shadow value will be halfway to black. Meaning, if you have your value scale, we'll pretend it's a perfect gradient. We'll pretend that there's a white there. Cool. Yeah, that works. Let's say that this value here is, I don't know, right there. The shadow part of it, as in the same thing in shadow, will be halfway to black. Now, if pure black is down here somewhere, this distance is what we're talking about, and we say half of that distance, this is the value that the shadow is going to be. And then the same thing for that. In that case, we have pure white. The shadow for that will be halfway to black. So you take that whole distance to black, put it in half, and it's going to be that value. You could do it with numbers too, like with Photoshop and stuff, there's 0 to 100, and just do the math that way. But let's just eyeball it. In this case, we want this to be darker, and actually this part too. And I'm just going to shade it so that it feels like it's approximately like around this value. And this gradient value scale isn't perfect, but it's close. All right, so, it's almost there. Now I didn't press super hard because I didn't want it to go to the full black. Again, I'm using a 0.7, I think HB to maybe 2B. I might have gotten a 2B in there, but I'm pretty sure it's HB. Because if I made this too dark, it would have not have made sense with that value. So let's go ahead and shade the white value with something approximately that darkness. And then you'll get this like optical illusion that we're kind of creating on paper of a shadow hitting it. It's beautiful. Works every time. Let's go ahead and extend that shadow onto the floor there, which is the same value because it's also white. We could imply a little bit of thickness of this. It's like a UFO saucer floating above it, right? So there's an illusion of shadow there. Now, if I, just as a test experiment, let's put another shape here with a darker value and see how we can make that work. Let's put just we'll put another coin or something, and we'll make the local value maybe a bit more constrained. So local value will be about here. The shadow of it will be about there. I'll do the local value first. And to get that illusion to work, I'm going to press a little bit harder to get that darker value. Definitely a more subtle shift because your constraints are much tighter, but the effect is still there. It's pretty strong. You can kind of shade over the whole thing. So going back to our painting the cube, we have to sort of assess or kind of eyeball what that value is and what would feel like it's halfway to black. So first I'm just going to make it darker as if I'm painting it this value. As I get to here, I know it's going to be darker, but let's do this side first because it's the darkest side, and that's where we're going to find our halfway to black. So this value is kind of like around that, right? And then the shadow side is going to be kind of in that area. So I'm going to make sure it's darker, and you'll know it's working when it feels like it's contrasting well with the top side. All right, so this top part is the brightest, and then as we turn to this side, it's the darkest. What about this side? Well, what I like to do is, in this scenario for the 1, 2, 3 read, making this halfway to black, I would make this 25% way to black, meaning if here's our gradient again, and here's our starting value, halfway to black is around here, 25% way to black is about there. So quarter way to black. So it'll be darker, but not as dark as the shadow side. And I'll have to probably adjust some stuff to make it really work. Obviously, this is much easier in Photoshop because I can just look at the numbers, but being able to do this by hand is really helpful. All right, so even the hotspot highlight can't be as bright as the hotspot highlight on the lighter side, unless, of course, it's got this kind of chrome semi-gloss or something. So I'm going to also shade that in. And then you should end up with something like that. It's three-dimensional, has two different values, well, local values, and it has the 1, 2, 3 read. That's kind of what we're looking for. This will definitely come in handy as you're sketching ideas with characters, faces, trying to indicate different patterns on clothing, which will kind of, I'll show you what I really like to do once I've done the same demonstration on the cylinder. So we'll just draw a line like this, kind of paint it all one value first. And it kind of feels like it's the same value across the whole way, which is the problem. We need this part, this core shadow, to also be darker. Somewhat halfway to black. It's a really good exercise to do. Now it feels three-dimensional, etc. Nice. Now what I like to do with that effect, because it feels cool on a cylinder, is if we have like a sleeve on an arm. We got the little hand there, shoulder. I like to do a lot of dark circus kind of clown kind of stuff, dolls and whatnot. Draw these little stripes, and very easy. Just kind of first treat it like a regular cylinder. Right, and then I'll go to each stripe, and much like this, fill it in with one value. And then make the cylinder shading match. Same thing as we did here. Well, similar. And then there's a nice little optical illusion that happens that I absolutely love. So we could go ahead and do the same thing to the cone and the sphere, but I think just by doing these two and these explains everything you need to know if you did want to do that. Same thing. Let's just go ahead and see if you can go in there and do a wireframe over your character and figure out, unless there's a bevel here, there won't be a rim light.